The mule froze first, head high ears, stiff, refusing to take another step. A moment later, the steer he'd been tracking stopped too, staring at something half buried in the sand. Silas Brannick swung down from the saddle, his bad leg aching as his boot hit the ground. The wind cut through the desert like a rasp, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and old dust. A few steps closer, and he saw at a hand, dark and still, fingers curled in grit. She was breathing just barely. He knelt, brushing sand from her face, the heat of her fever burning against his calloused palm. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself faced with a choice you couldn't turn away from. Silas had been riding this land most of his life. But the Jornada Basin in winter was no place for a man to linger, let alone a wounded woman. He'd come up rough-born in a cabin where his mother kept the stove hot on Sundays, and his father taught him to work a fence before he could read the good book. They'd measured a person by their word, and you didn't leave a neighbor or a stranger alone in trouble. Silas had carried that with him through the war and back again, even when the war left him with a limp and a silence that settled deep in his bones. After the fever took his wife and young boy 7 years ago, he'd turned his life inward. The ranch was small, just enough cattle to keep the bills paid if winter didn't run too long. Money was tight. Every steer mattered. But compared to the boom towns springing up along the rail lines with their glass front stores and lawyers cutting land into parcels, his world was a lean one. He cooked his own meals, patched his own roof, and bartered more than he bought. The men who ran the cattle barons' outfits south of here wouldn't understand it. They had bank accounts and hired hands, while Silas had a bedroll, a steady horse, and the miles of open land between his fence lines. It was that life stripped down and quiet that made the sight of her so sharp in his mind. A woman left to die this far from water didn't get there by accident. The shallow scrape in the sand was no grave dug by nature. Someone had chosen this spot for her to be found by no one at all. He didn't ask himself if he should help. He was already untying his bedroll, wrapping her in canvas, and lifting her onto the mule before the thought could settle. By the time he reached his cabin, dusk was laying long shadows across the canyon rim. The fire inside threw a low orange light against the adobe walls, warming the single bed, the worn table, and the 2 chairs he rarely used. He eased her down the ragged deer hide clinging to her like old bark and set a damp cloth to her brow. Her eyes stayed shut, breath rough but steady. Outside, the wind scraped across the eaves. Inside, the only sound was her breathing and the slow pop of the fire. Silas sat back in the chair, rifle across his lap, watching the way the blanket rose and fell over her ribs. Whoever had left her might come looking, or maybe they'd already counted her gone. He didn't know which it was, but the thought kept him awake long after the fire burned down to coals. And just before dawn, as the first pale light touched the ridge, a shadow moved past the window. He wasn't sure yet if it was a trick of the wind, or the beginning of something else entirely. The first light came gray over the ridge, slow and cold, casting the cabin walls in a pale wash. I had spent most of the night in the chair by the fire. The rifle leaned where I could reach it. Every time the wind shifted, it tapped the shutters in a way that made me half expect footsteps. Across the room, Nuna lay where I'd set her the evening before, still wrapped in the blanket, her breathing shallow but even. The fever heat I'd felt through the cloth on her forehead was still there, though not as fierce. Her lips were cracked and dry, her hair matted to her temple. The torn deer hide she wore had slipped down one shoulder, showing a line of bruises that told me more than any words would have. When her eyes opened, they were steady on me, not wide with fear, but not soft either. She watched without speaking, her brow lifting just enough to show she was alert. I dipped the cloth into the bowl again, held it to her mouth, and this time she drank. She didn't thank me, didn't look away, just took what she needed and settled back into the pillow. I told her she wouldn't be walking for a while, so she'd be staying here until she could. No answer, only the faintest shift in her gaze. I let it be. While she rested, I stepped outside into the bite of morning air. The mule was standing easy near the fence, my horse nosing the water trough. I fed them both, checked the latches on the corral gate, then hauled 2 buckets from the well. The quiet had a weight to it out here, especially with someone else inside the cabin. Usually my days started without any voice, but my own to keep me company. Now there was the sound of her breathing in the background, and it changed the way the place felt. By midday, she stirred again. I turned from the stove and saw her sitting upright, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress for balance. She glanced at her dress, then at the blanket, pulling it higher over her chest. Her arms were marked with scratches and sunburn, her legs hidden under the blanket but moving stiffly. I poured her a cup of water and set it in her hands. I told her I wasn't going to ask what had happened, not unless she wanted to tell me. Something in her face eased at that. I added my name, Silas Brannock Rancher, and left it there. She didn't offer hers. That afternoon, she tried to walk. I caught sight of her in the doorway, barefoot, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She moved toward the trough, bent to wash her hands and splash her face, then sat on the edge of the porch. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, as though she were measuring the distance to something unseen. We didn't speak. Later, when I brought her a bowl of stew, she took it without hesitation. That more than anything told me she might be willing to stay for a while. The next few days settled into a rhythm. She limped between the bed and the hearth, favoring her left side. The bruises along her ribs darkened before they began to fade. I went about the chores, mending fence, tending the stock, hauling water. And each time I returned, she was somewhere in the cabin, quiet, but watching. At first, she kept the blanket around her, even while cooking or tending the fire. By the 3rd morning, she'd gone back to wearing the deer hide ragged as it was. I had left a stitched shirt folded on the bed for her, but she never touched it. That same morning, I found her crouched at the stove, coaxing the fire from coals. Her back was to me, the strap of her dress fallen again, her shoulders squared. I told her where to place the kindling to draw better. She glanced at the rock I pointed to, adjusted the logs without a word, and stood. Then she gestured to the bucket where I kept the cornmeal. I stepped back and let her work. Her limp was still there, but she moved with more purpose. Soon, 2 bowls were on the table. We ate without speaking, but it wasn't the same silence as before. By late afternoon, I was out checking the west fence. The ground showed signs of javelina rooting through the brush, and I made note of where the wire would need tightening. My thoughts kept circling back to her. A woman like Nuna, though I didn't yet know her name, wouldn't have been left in that desert unless she'd defied someone powerful in her own circle. I'd seen it during the war, women punished for refusing marriages arranged for land or alliances. When I rode back in, the sun was low, turning the canyon rim to red. She stood barefoot in the dirt by the fence, watching the cattle graze. The wind moved through her hair, loosening the ties, and her dress clung to her frame in the breeze. She didn't look back until I was almost beside her. I told her she shouldn't be out without boots. She only pointed to the steps, where her moccasins sat worn and split at the seams. I asked if she meant to be gone by spring. She met my eyes then and spoke for the first time. They left me for dead. The words were low but clear. I told her I'd figured as much. She went on she'd been promised to a man she would not marry. She had fought, clawed his face. I told her good. The surprise in her eyes lasted only a moment before she turned toward the house. Inside, she moved with more ease now, her limp slight. We shared the stew she had left warming on the stove. Later, while I sat sharpening my knife, I asked her name. She said Nuna. I told her it could stay with her if she wanted it. She lay down near the fire, and before closing her eyes, I heard her say she wanted it. A week passed in that way. The mornings grew colder, frost whitening the trough and the ground beyond the ridge. Nuna took to helping where she could, sweeping the cabin, patching a tear in my coat, gathering brush for kindling. She never spoke of the man she'd refused or the tribe that had left her behind. The set of her shoulders was still strong, but now and then I heard her hum while she worked. One morning I found her outside feeding the mule wrapped in a wool shawl I'd given her. She straightened when she saw me, her voice rough but steady. "Is it strange for you that I'm here?" I told her maybe strange, but not wrong. She studied me a moment, then said she wouldn't have married him, even if it meant dying. I told her she hadn't died. The look she gave me held something that felt like understanding. That evening, snow began to fall thin at first, then heavier, drifting across the low brush and rattling the windows. We stayed inside. She sat on the bed, shawl around her shoulders, while I oiled my rifle at the table. Out of the quiet, she spoke of a place with trees with water running through stone. Before she was old enough to bleed, she said she had been brought here. After the treaty broke, her parents gone, her uncle had raised her until she became worth something to someone else. I told her of my wife and boy, buried up past the ridge. She asked if I still spoke to them. I said sometimes. She moved to the hearth, the firelight catching the line of her neck, the shadows across her chest. I told her she owed me nothing. She said she knew. The space between us felt heavier, then filled with what neither of us was saying. I reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away. The fire cracked behind her, the snow whispering against the windows, and she stepped toward me. The kiss that followed was slow and certain. No claim in it, only the quiet of two people choosing to stay close. When we pulled apart, she said she didn't want to run. I told her she didn't have to. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the night held its own kind of stillness, one I knew would not last forever. The thaw came slow that spring, the creek behind the ridge running fuller than it had in years. Nuna and I worked side by side, fixing fence posts and mending what the winter had broken. Her hands were steady now, the limp fading into the dust beneath her moccasins. I noticed how the deer hide she wore was patched and tightened in places, the fabric softened by sun and sweat. But she wore it with a quiet sort of pride that didn't ask for attention. We didn't say much during those long days, but the silence between us carried a weight of something new. An understanding shaped by shared survival and cautious hope. She took to sorting the stores in the cabin, arranging jars of coffee flour and lard with care while I sharpened knives or checked the watering trough. One morning I caught her squatting by the stove, coaxing a stubborn fire back to life. The strap of her dress had slipped again, revealing the soft curve of her shoulder. She didn't pull it up, and I didn't ask her to. She moved through the cabin like she belonged there, the dust settling around her as if it had been waiting. At night she lay closer than before, her back pressed against my chest beneath the blanket. Her fingers would trace the faint scar near my hip, a quiet reassurance that neither of us needed to voice. When she spoke, her voice was still rough, but carried less of the sharp edges it once held. She told me of a place with trees and running water, a home stolen by treaties and broken promises. I shared what little I could about my own losses, my wife and boy buried in the earth past the ridge. Neither of us expected to find comfort here, but the slow-growing warmth between us said otherwise. Still, the land outside reminded us of its harshness. Tracks showed signs of others' men who might come back for Nuna. She watched the horizon more often, eyes sharp as a hawk's. One evening she told me plainly they might come to finish what had been started. I promised I wouldn't let that happen. Together we prepared for what was coming, our routine settling into something steady, anchored by resolve. The days grew longer, but the nights stayed cold and heavy. Then one afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, alone, deliberate. The shape lingered, watching. We didn't speak much after that, but we both felt the change. The quiet we'd found was on borrowed time. When the men came again this time, more than one, I was ready. Nuna stood beside me barefoot and firm in the doorway, her dress torn but her spirit unbroken. The old laws they tried to enforce wouldn't hold here. As the sun faded behind the canyon walls, the next move belonged to them. But neither of us would be the same come dawn. The rider on the ridge hadn't been a mistake. By the third morning after we'd seen him, 3 men came up the canyon trail just after sunrise. They rode thin horses, their coats worn from long miles, faces covered with scarves against the wind. No feathers, no paint, no sound but the creak of leather and the low snort of their mounts. Nuna stepped outside with me barefoot. On the packed dirt, her arms folded across her chest. They didn't dismount. The one in front spoke in Apache, his voice flat and measured. Nuna answered in the same tongue, her jaw set tighter with each exchange. When they fell silent, she looked at me and translated. They said she had been promised to an elder's son. Staying here meant war. I told her to have them speak to me, but she shook her head. "You're not their concern," she said quietly. I stepped forward anyway. I told them I didn't know their laws, but I knew this woman hadn't been given a choice, and she had one now. The leader stared at me a long moment, then spat in the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off without a word. We didn't speak as they disappeared down the trail. Inside, I saw her hands shaking when she set the kettle back on the stove. She didn't eat that night, just sat near the hearth, knees drawn up, staring at the flames. I laid a blanket around her shoulders and told her I wouldn't let them take her. She didn't answer, so I said it again. This time she leaned into me, her voice low. "No one's ever spoken for me without wanting something in return." I told her I wasn't asking for anything. She looked at me, eyes bright from the firelight. "They'll come back?" I nodded once. "I'll be waiting." The next days passed under a sharper kind of quiet. We went about chores, but our eyes often went to the ridge. She began keeping the rifle closer to the door when I was outside. At night, I made her sleep on the inside of the bed, away from the windows, while I stayed half awake listening. On the 7th morning, the sound of hooves came again, more of them this time. I stepped to the doorway, the rifle in my hands, and saw 7 riders moving through the canyon without a cry or a shout. Nuna spotted them first and stood behind me, her bare feet in the dust. This time their leader was older, his eyes dark and steady. He spoke to her in their language, but I didn't need to understand the words. Her answers were strong, her chin high. She told him he didn't own her, that his people had buried her in the ground, and walked away. He looked past her to me. "This is what you choose?" he asked through her. Nuna stepped forward and took my hand. "I choose a man who didn't walk past me in the dust." I told him she was not his to claim. The silence after was long enough for the wind to press through the canyon. Finally, he gave a single nod. "I won't come again," he said to her. "If they come after you, it will not be because I sent them." She inclined her head in acknowledgement, and he turned his horse. The rest followed without looking back. When they were gone, I set the rifle aside and knelt in front of her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders dropping for the first time in weeks. Tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You stayed?" she whispered. I told her I always would. She managed a small nod, and her hand found mine. That night, the air felt different, lighter, though the work ahead hadn't changed. We still had fences to mend, cattle to watch, and a ridge to keep an eye on. But for the first time, the horizon didn't seem like something closing in. It felt like space we could use. We sat on the porch as the light faded, the sky running gold into the rim. She leaned against my shoulder, her hair brushing my coat. "If I had a child," she said after a while, "would you raise it with me?" I looked at her, saw no trace of doubt in her eyes, and told her yes. She rested her hand on her belly, and we sat there until the stars began to show, listening to the land settle for the night. Spring came early, and the creek past the ridge was running full by the first week of March. The frost still clung to the ground at dawn, but the soil had softened enough for planting. Nuna had already marked a patch behind the cabin, tucking beans into the earth with careful fingers. I built a low frame of split rails to keep the cattle from trampling the chutes. Her moccasins stayed by the door now, and her dress hung beside my coat on the peg. She moved through the place like she'd been here for years. We worked together most days, mending saddle straps, checking fence lines, splitting wood for the stove. She didn't need to be told where something went or how I liked things done. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch as the sun slipped down behind the canyon rim. Sometimes she'd speak of her uncle's lodge in the high country or the way the pines sounded in the wind before the treaty broke. Other times we'd say nothing at all, letting the quiet speak for us. The signs started small. A track in the mud near the southern pass, not mine. A broken branch where no cattle had been. Once I found an old fire pit still warm beneath a layer of ash. I covered it with dirt and said nothing. But I saw Nuna watching the horizon more often. On the 7th night after the first track, she spoke plain. "They might come," she said, her voice steady but low. I nodded. "I know." She told me if they came, it wouldn't be to take her back. It would be to finish what they'd started. I told her they'd find she wasn't alone now. She studied my face for a moment, then asked, "You'd fight them?" I told her if they came with guns or knives, I would. She didn't flinch. Instead, she laid her hand on my arm and said, "Then I stay with you." I told her she already did. That night, after the lantern was blown out, she spoke again in the dark. "If something happens, if I can't stay, I want you to know I would have chosen you, even if none of this happened." I didn't answer. With the words, just pulled her close and kept her there until the cold wind outside was no more than a sound in the distance. The wind shifted 2 mornings later, carrying the smell of pine from far off in the hills. By midday, the ground was soft enough that my boots sank when I walked to the corral. Nuna followed me out the hem of her dress, brushing against bare legs, shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. She stood near the trough, her eyes fixed on the dead cottonwood above the ridge. "That where they are?" she asked. I nodded. "Wife, boy. Buried them under it when it was still alive." She said they'd be proud. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't say that out loud. We fixed the east fence together that afternoon, her hands steady as she held the post while I drove nails. She tied off the wire when my fingers cramped. The sun warmed the air enough that the scent of cedar rose from the fence rails. By the time we walked back toward the cabin, the light had gone gold. On the porch, she asked if I wanted her gone by spring. I told her no. She said there was no tribe left for her. I told her she wasn't property here. That night, she cooked cornbread and dried venison. While it baked, she took my hand without asking, her fingers tracing the back of my palm. "Why didn't you leave me there?" she asked. I thought about it and told her the truth. "I saw your eyes. You weren't begging, you were daring me not to help." She let out a soft sound, half laugh, half sigh, and kissed me. This time it was longer, her hands at my collar. When we pulled apart, she told me she wanted me to touch her, but only if I wanted her. I told her she didn't owe me a thing. She guided my hand to her side where the bruises had been. "Then stay here with me," she whispered. And I did. The next morning, she stood at the window before dawn, watching the gray lift into pale blue. Her breath fogged the glass. I sat up and saw the loose folds of her shawl sliding down her arms, the strap of her dress fallen again. She came to the bed and said, "You never asked if you could keep me." I told her I didn't keep people, they stayed or they didn't. She said I touched her like she wasn't broken. I told her she wasn't. When she pulled me to my feet, there was no hurry in it. I brushed her hair back, kissed her slow, and she led me toward the bed. The fire crackled low behind us. She met my gaze as I loosened the ties of her dress. We lay together, without rush, learning the shape of trust as much as the shape of each other. Later, she lay with her leg draped over mine and asked if I still thought about my wife. I told her every day. She said my wife would be glad I was warm again. I didn't answer, just kissed her forehead. Outside, the day brightened. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the quiet felt like something we'd built together. Whatever was coming, we'd meet it side by side. The weather held steady for a week, warm enough to bring the first shoots up in Nuna's garden. But there was something in the air that put me on edge. It wasn't just the tracks we'd found before, it was the stillness. The kind that settles before trouble shows itself. Nuna must have felt it too. She worked close to the cabin eyes, flicking to the ridge now, and again her shawl always within reach, even on warmer afternoons. On the 12th morning of March, a lone rider appeared on the far ridge. He sat his horse for several minutes, without moving the sun at his back, so I couldn't make out his face. Then he turned and disappeared over the rise. I didn't say anything, but I checked the rifle and made sure the shotgun under the bed was loaded. Nuna kept her thoughts to herself, but that evening, I saw her gathering more water and bringing in extra kindling without a word. By the next night, smoke was rising from beyond the southern pass. It wasn't the kind from travelers passing through, it was camp smoke set low to smolder. Nuna came to stand beside me in the doorway and said, "They sent scouts. They're watching to see if I'm still alive." I asked her if she wanted to leave. The look she gave me was sharp enough to cut the air. "No," she said. "Then we don't run," I answered. That night I made her sleep on the side of the bed furthest from the windows. I sat by the chair with the rifle across my knees until my eyes blurred. Before she settled, she put her hand on my chest and said, "They will try to make it shameful for you being with me." I told her they could try. The first to come were 3 men just after sunrise. They rode up without hurry, stopping short of the fence. Nuna stepped out with me, her arms folded, her feet bare on the cold ground. The lead rider spoke to her in Apache, the words short and hard. She answered the same way, then turned to tell me what was said. She was told she had been promised to an elder's son, and staying here meant war. I stepped forward, telling them I didn't know their laws. But I knew she hadn't been given a choice, and she had one now. The leader looked me over, spat in the dirt, and rode off with the others behind him. We didn't speak until they were gone from sight. Inside, she sat near the fire with her knees drawn up. I put a blanket over her shoulders and said I wouldn't let them take her. She leaned into me, her voice unsteady. "No one has ever spoken for me without wanting something in return." I told her I wasn't asking for anything. She looked up at me and said, "They'll come back." I nodded. I hope they do. 3 mornings later, they did come back. This time, 7 riders. They moved through the canyon in silence, their horses' hooves crunching over the frozen dirt. Nuna stood in the doorway behind me, her dress hanging loose on one shoulder, her posture straight. The leader this time was older, his eyes dark and steady. He spoke to her in Apache, but I didn't need to understand the words to hear the meaning in her voice when she answered. She told him he didn't own her, that his people had buried her, and walked away. He looked at me and asked through her if this was what I chose. Nuna stepped forward and took my hand. "I choose a man who didn't walk past me in the dust," she said. I told him she wasn't his to claim. The pause that followed was long enough for the wind to press through the canyon. Then he gave a single nod. "I won't come again," he said to her. "If they come after you, it won't be because I sent them." She bowed her head slightly, not in thanks, just acknowledgement. He mounted up and left without looking back. When they were gone, she sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping for the first time in weeks. Tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. I set the rifle aside and knelt in front of her. "You're safe," I told her. She nodded, her voice low. "You stayed." I told her I'd never ask her to leave. Weeks later, the creek was running strong, and the corn in her garden was sprouting in neat rows. One evening, as we sat on the porch steps under a sky full of stars, she turned to me and asked, "If I had a child, would you raise it with me?" I looked at her a long moment, then nodded. She rested her hand low on her belly, and we sat there until the air cooled, the sound of the creek steady in the distance. The days after the riders left carried a strange quiet. The air felt lighter, but I didn't mistake it for safety. Nuna worked her garden, humming low as she pressed seeds into the soil while I split rails for the corral. We didn't speak much about what had passed. The land itself seemed to be holding still, as if deciding whether to let us keep what we'd built. By April, the chutes in her plot were standing a few inches high, and the creek was running cold and clear. We added a second frame of rails around the beans after I saw deer tracks close to the edge. Nuna spent more time outside, now moving with the same quiet she had when she'd first come here, but without the same weight in her step. At night, she sat close to me by the fire, the shawl loose around her shoulders, her eyes following the flames while I oiled the rifle. One evening, as the light faded, she told me she'd had dreams of her uncle's lodge again. The smell of pine, the sound of water over stone, voices she knew but couldn't see. I listened without breaking the steady rhythm of the cloth on the barrel. When she fell quiet, I told her there was room here for any part of her that wanted to stay. She met my eyes and nodded once. Work was steady that month. We mended the roof after a windstorm loosened half the shingles on the north side. She helped hold the ladder, her hair catching the light as the sun came over the ridge. Inside, she had taken to keeping the shelves neat, arranging jars by size, folding my spare shirts, and setting them in the trunk. I noticed small things: her moccasins lined neatly by the door at night, the way she'd set the kettle near the edge of the stove so I didn't have to lean far with my bad leg. It was late in the month when I noticed the smoke, thin, curling up from beyond the ridge, too far for any rancher I knew, and not in the direction of town. I said nothing, but Nuna caught the shift in my eyes when I looked past her. The next morning, I checked the fence along the south pasture and found a post cut clean through. The wire hung slack, the tracks around it fresh. That evening, she stood on the porch with me, her arms folded tight against the cooling air. "If they come again," she said, "it won't be to talk." I told her we'd meet them the same way we met the last. She studied the ground for a long moment, then looked up. "I'm not afraid to stand with you," I believed her. We moved the livestock closer to the cabin over the next 2 days and stacked more wood inside. I made sure the lanterns were filled and the weapons cleaned. Nuna kept the well bucket drawn and a pot on the stove. There was no talk of leaving. On the third evening, just before the light broke completely, we heard hoofbeats in the distance. Not many, 2, maybe 3. They didn't come close enough to see the cabin circling wide before fading toward the south pass. Nuna stood in the doorway until the sound was gone. "They're looking for weakness," she said. I told her they'd find none here. The next morning we worked as we always did, but the air carried that same stillness I'd felt before the last trouble. She brought in the laundry from the line before the clouds moved over the ridge. I stacked the last of the cut wood by the door. Neither of us said it, but we knew something was coming. That night the wind rose, and the smell of wood smoke drifted faint from somewhere beyond the canyon. We sat by the fire, the light catching the curve of her jaw as she turned toward me. "If it comes to it," she said, "I want you to know I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else." I reached across and set my hand over hers. Outside, the wind carried the sound of something moving in the dark. The sound in the dark drew closer, no more than the creak of saddle leather and the low snort of a horse. I stood just inside the doorway, lantern light spilling across the porch boards, the rifle loose in my hands. Nuna moved to stand beside me, her shawl pulled tight, eyes fixed on the shadows. When the figures came into view, they weren't the riders we'd feared. Sheriff Talbot led the way, his badge catching a glint from the lantern. Behind him rode 2 deputies and a wagon. They'd found the men who'd cut our fence, caught them near the South Pass with a string of stolen cattle. Talbot said they'd be standing before the circuit judge in a week. I felt the weight lift in a way it hadn't for months. Nuna's shoulders eased, though she didn't step back from the doorway. The sheriff tipped his hat to her, then to me, and told us the charges would hold. The law had its part to play, and for once, it had played it straight. By morning, the wind had carried off the last of the night's unease. We set about putting the south fence back in order, each post driven deep, the wire stretched tight. Nuna worked steady beside me, the sun warming her face, her hair lifting in the breeze. There was no talk of moving on, not from her, not from me. Over the next weeks, the cabin settled into a rhythm I hadn't known was possible. The garden grew strong, the creek ran clear, and the nights were quiet. Sometimes I'd catch Nuna on the porch, watching the far hills, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. But when I joined her, she'd glance my way and smile, and that was enough. I came to understand that justice out here wasn't always loud or quick. Sometimes it was a sheriff riding up in the dark, sometimes a woman choosing to stay when she could have gone. What mattered was holding to your ground, making a place where decency could take root and stay. Looking back now, I reckon the land taught us both the same lesson: you can't control who rides in from the horizon, but you can decide who gets to stay at your fire. Nuna chose to stay, and I chose to make sure she never had to stand alone again. If you've ever known what it means to hold fast through the hard seasons and find your place at last, I hope you'll share this story with someone who'll understand. And if it's found you at the right time, well, you know the worth of that.